Today we're with Grant Sheehan, a photographer based in Wellington, New Zealand. He founded Phantom House Publishing in 1994 and has authored and photographed many iconic titles since then. Let's talk with Grant and find out his secrets to success. Grant, were you born here in Wellington, New Zealand?
Well, I was actually born in Lower Hutt, and I lived here till the grand old age of 2 years.
Goodness.
And then my parents moved to Nelson,
Yes.
Brightwater actually, and that was my hometown. I lived there until my mid-20s really, so I grew up in Nelson.
Yes. Great. Okay. And how early did you get the photography bug?
Quite early. My first real job in Nelson was a survey draftsman, and I did a bit of a cadetship, and then I worked for a Nelson timber company, which is actually Bajan Son. And my job was to create maps out of aerial photographs.
Oh wow!
So every month or so, the company would hire an aircraft, especially made for this purpose, and overfly the forests. And it had a huge built-in camera.
Yes.
I was always interested in photography anyway, and I had a camera since I was a kid. And that really got me seriously stuck on photography. Yeah.
Just winding forward to today, what sort of camera do you prefer to use today?
It took me a wee while to switch over to digital. I stuck with film a little bit longer than a lot of others, but once I did, I was just blown away really by what digital could do and the technology. But now every new generation of camera has better resolution, better HDR, better autofocus, and so the latest camera is always the best camera. So I tend to stay with the latest camera. So whenever anything comes out that's a bit of a quantum leap, I'll buy it. And I mostly had Nikon, although I have to say that I'm not a brand snob. And it's just sort of panned out that way. My latest camera is a Nikon D50, which is 46 megapixel full frame camera. And it's pretty impressive, but there'll be a better one along in 18 months, no doubt.
Wow. You're known for publishing at least 4 books on New Zealand lighthouses. Can you tell us what inspired you to do that?
Well, I always had a thing about lighthouses, and I think it sprung from the fact that growing up in Nelson, we lived out at Brightwater, and as a kid we used to come in every Friday night to pick up my father for the weekends, and we always drove past Nelson's wonderful wee lighthouse, and as a young kid I was always incredibly interested and curious about this lighthouse.
Yes.
And the fact that the light was sort of pointing outwards, and it had quite a sort of mystique to me.
Yes.
And I think that kind of must have triggered something, because really from that point I've been interested in lighthouses. And having visited every New Zealand lighthouse multiple times over the years, and quite a few overseas ones, I have to say I'm still just as crazy about them as I am.
Yes. Can you tell us a story about one of your favourite lighthouse shoots?
Well, just about every lighthouse I've been to, especially the fact that I've been to a lot of them multiple times, sort of has a story attached to it.
Yes.
But I think Waipapa Lighthouse, which is probably one of the more poignant places to visit. It's sort of on the coast, quite a wild coast, quite some distance from any of the villages and things in the area. And it often has quite heavy surf and quite sort of hard weather. Yes. And of course it was the scene of New Zealand's worst civilian shipwreck with the Tararua, which 131 people drowned.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's a very tragic story, because basically the ship ran aground in 1884 on the reef where the lighthouse is now, and it was a beautiful day, and it wasn't much sea, and no one thought it was too big a problem. They thought they could get everybody off okay.
Yes.
But they tried to just get the tide to lift them off, and that didn't work. And then the sea started to get heavier and heavier, and a lot of people from the local villages had come to the shore. And by the time they realised that they were in trouble, the sea was so rough, getting them off wasn't really an option. And so all these people watched while this ship with 151 people on it sort of broke up, basically. And there were so many bodies that the locals buried them in one big grave, basically. most of the times I've been there to do twilight shots or night shots, because that's when lighthouses are doing their thing.
Yeah.
And I can never get out of my head the fact that what a sad place this is, and that happened, and it would have been an unexpected and horrific thing for the locals, and there's a sort of a blanket sadness over the whole sort of area. So I guess that's one place that left a big impression on me. When I photographed it for the Lights in the Landscape book, it was a beautiful clear night, moonlit night. While I was photographing, this beautiful hazy mist sort of rolled in and across the sky, and you could see the stars through it, and it just seemed really sort of mysterious and beautiful.
And staying with the theme of lighthouses, you've written 2 children's books about lighthouses. Would you like to tell us about those?
The first one is called Ivan and the Lighthouse, about Ivan and his father James, who were actual people. They lived at Devonport, and the lighthouse was in Auckland Harbour, Bean Rock Lighthouse, I should say. Ivan wasn't allowed out to the lighthouse. His mother thought it was a bit dangerous as a young child, so his father would go out there every night. And anyway, he wanted to go there, and eventually he was allowed to. And so the book really is about that and the adventures he had while he was there. Several things happened during that 3 years. There was a shipwreck in the harbour, actually. A ship hit rocks in the harbour. So it wouldn't sink, they threw all the cargo into the harbour, and the cargo was mutton. And of course sharks all came in, and for 3 days all this mutton was floating around in the harbour, was inundated with sharks.
Goodness.
The other one is the Lucy Goes to the Lighthouse. This is quite a special story, really. It's a story of New Zealand's first lighthouse keeper, Mary Jane Bennett, and New Zealand's first and only woman lighthouse keeper. So basically Lucy, who's a young modern girl, goes to the lighthouse. She doesn't really want to, but her mother wants to, so she goes with her mother on their mountain bikes, and they have a picnic, and she asks about the lighthouse keeper. And her mother tells her the story of Mary Jane Bennett.
Oh, lovely.
Because her husband, who was going to be the keeper while they were building the lighthouse, drowned crossing the harbour.
Gosh.
They've been living there for 2 or 3 years in a cottage, and on the Pencarrow Ridge, which is in the winter is a terribly unpleasant place to be. Really bad weather, freezing cold, icy winds, and she had 5 children. And she did such a great job. She had to write a report every 2 weeks, and she had to keep the light burning, which meant staying up at night, and she had to learn how to use it and everything. Yes. And she took to it and was so efficient that they asked her if she would stay on as the lighthouse keeper. So it was an amazing story of an amazing woman, and of course our first lighthouse.
Yes. So Grant, can you tell us just how difficult it could be to reach these lighthouses in order to get your photographs sometimes?
About a third of New Zealand's lighthouses you can drive to, which is great.
Yeah.
But the ones in the Cook Strait, of course, and in some areas are still quite difficult to get to. And probably one of the most difficult ones to get to is the Brothers out on the Cook Strait, which is basically a couple of little islands with a few little rocks around them. One really memorable trip to Brothers was when I was doing the first Lighthouse book. And we actually went out there in the light tender, and the Ministry of Transport had made that available to us, and they were also taking supplies out there. And this was when there were still keepers there, 1989. It was quite a swell at the time when we arrived at the lighthouse, and you got on it by climbing into a net which dangled from the end of a crane. And in calm water that wasn't so bad, but in a heavy swell, basically the ship was moving from side to side, so you had to jump into this net, or jump and hang onto it and pull yourself into it.
Oh my gosh.
And of course, as soon as you did that, the boat disappeared, and the sea was under you, and then the boat came back. And I had a heavy, in those days I had used medium format camera, and I had a heavy tripod and a whole lot of gear on my back. So I was a little bit nervous that if I missed my jump, I'd probably go straight to the bottom of the Cook Strait.
Yes.
And once I got on the island, the head keeper wasn't there to meet me, but I could see him up with the lighthouse. And one of the assistant keeper came down and said, we're expecting you, feel free to wander around. And I said, I'd like to meet the head keeper. And he said, well, he's not talking to you because the Ministry of Transport hadn't given him enough notice that you're coming. Only 2 weeks' notice.
Oh.
But years later, I went to a reunion of the keepers after all the keepers had gone and Lighthouse has been demanded. And he came up to me and apologised and said, "I'm really sorry about how I behaved that time you came." He said, "We were out there for a month, 6 weeks at a time, and we used to suffer from a thing we called rock madness, in which we'd get really obsessive about really little things." And just the isolation, basically. And so we shook hands and it was all okay. But that was quite an amusing experience.
So as far as your style of photography, architecture, landscape, people, can you explain for us what you would say your style is?
I think composition is important. I don't necessarily follow the traditional composition rules. In fact, there's quite a few photographic rules I don't follow because I do what I intuitively feel is working, and also I'm very interested in the narrative or the story, and that comes first before any rules that someone made up. And more recently, especially with the Nightwatcher book, I've experimented quite aggressively with composition. I actually like creating a composition where there's a certain amount of weight that all works together, but it doesn't have to be apparent at the first glance. And I like the idea of having to look at and read a photo and it suddenly comes together for you, for the viewer. I mean.
So could you explain to us how you plan and take an Astro shot?
A really good example of that question is the shot I took of Kapiti Island from the Paikokariki lookout, looking down along the Kapiti coast. There's a time, which is about 3 or 4 days a year, when you can have the full moon setting in the early evening and the Milky Way rising in the same shot. And so I would go there during those times, and each time I went there over a period of years, the weather was bad or there was some factor that meant it didn't work. And finally, I had success when I went there a few months ago, and everything was perfect. It was a perfect night. It was beautifully clear. I shot it as a panorama, and in the middle of the shot, it had the coastline and the Kapiti Coast village and Kapiti Island, beautiful stars, rolling hills on one side, moonlit sea on the other, and was just the perfect shot. And then just to top it off, just as I was doing it, a couple of boy racer cars turned up and had a race and whizzed down the hill at really high speed with lots of red brake lights and lots of spectacular sort of lighting, and got right to the bottom during the exposure, which made for an exceptional photo with a whole bunch of elements and narrative in it.
Is there anything you'd like to say to all those photographers out there?
Well, I think, just as I said before, really, just get out there and take photographs first and foremost. Doesn't really matter what your camera is. It's good if you can have the best camera, but it doesn't matter if you haven't. Just get out there, and it's the photograph and the finding the photograph and seeing the photograph. That's all you really need to do to get yourself started. And just remember that every time you head out with a camera, there's a possibility of an adventure out there. Something new that you didn't know or haven't seen before.
Thanks once again for your time. It's been a real pleasure meeting you and looking at your work and just hearing what you have to say about photography in general. So from Ray and I both, thanks very, very much, Grant.
You're most welcome. Cheers.